The scorching winds of ancient Persia carried more than sand and dust across the vast empire that once stretched from India to Greece. They carried whispers of terror, stories so horrific that even hardened warriors would cross themselves when the tales were told. In the shadow of towering ziggurats and beneath the watchful eyes of golden eagles, Persian monarchs didn't simply punish their enemies. They transformed human suffering into an art form so refined, so methodically cruel, that their methods would haunt civilization for millennia. This is not a story for the faint of heart. What you're about to discover goes beyond simple execution or imprisonment. The Persian Empire, with all its grandeur and architectural marvels, concealed within its palaces a darkness that would make medieval torture chambers seem merciful by comparison. These were rulers who understood that true power wasn't just about conquering territories or amassing gold. It was about creating fear so absolute, so penetrating, that the mere mention of their name could end rebellions before they began. The methods you're about to witness were not born from madness, but from calculated political strategy. Each horrific punishment served a purpose. Each act of cruelty was designed to send a message that would echo across the known world. From the marble halls of Persepolis to the furthest reaches of the empire, subjects learned that defying their god-kings meant facing consequences that transcended death itself. Today, we're going to examine the most disturbing punishments devised by Persian monarchs, methods so extreme that they influenced torture techniques for centuries afterward. We'll explore how these ancient rulers weaponized human psychology, turning fear into their most effective tool of governance. But first, let me give you a glimpse of what's coming, because understanding the full scope of Persian cruelty requires us to journey through layers of horror that most historical accounts dare not fully reveal. The Persian Empire wasn't built on military might alone. It was constructed on a foundation of terror, so sophisticated that neighboring kingdoms would surrender rather than face the creative punishments awaiting those who resisted. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated displays of power that served multiple purposes simultaneously. They eliminated threats, deterred future resistance, and demonstrated the godlike authority of the Persian throne. What made Persian punishments particularly terrifying was their duration and publicity. While other civilizations might execute prisoners quickly, Persian monarchs understood that prolonged suffering created more effective propaganda. They developed techniques that could keep victims alive and conscious for days, even weeks, while their bodies were systematically destroyed in full view of the public. These spectacles weren't just about justice. They were theater designed to break the spirit of anyone who might dare challenge Persian authority. The sophistication of these methods reflected the advanced nature of Persian civilization itself. This was an empire that produced stunning architecture, complex administrative systems, and remarkable engineering projects. The same intellectual capabilities that created the Royal Road and the magnificent palaces of Persepolis were applied to the science of human suffering. Persian torturers were craftsmen who approached their work with the same precision that architects applied to building temples. But perhaps most chilling of all was how these punishments became integrated into Persian culture and religion. The Zoroastrian concept of cosmic struggle between good and evil was perverted to justify the most extreme cruelties. Enemies of the state weren't just political opponents. They were agents of darkness who deserved to experience hell on earth. This religious framework allowed Persian rulers to present their cruelty not as tyranny, but as divine justice. The records of these punishments come from multiple sources, each providing pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Greek historians like Herodotus documented what they witnessed during their travels through Persian territories. Babylonian tablets preserved in cuneiform script describe punishments in clinical detail. Persian court records, when they dared to document such things, used euphemistic language that barely concealed the reality of what transpired in the empire's dungeons and execution grounds. Archaeological evidence supports many of these accounts. Excavations at Persian sites have uncovered specialized chambers, clearly designed for torture, with drainage systems to handle bodily fluids and attachment points for restraining victims. The physical infrastructure of cruelty was built into the very architecture of Persian power, suggesting that these punishments weren't aberrations, but central features of imperial policy. The geographic scale of the Persian Empire meant that news of these punishments traveled vast distances, creating a network of fear that extended far beyond Persia's borders. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers carried stories of Persian cruelty back to their homelands, where the tales grew in the telling. This psychological warfare was perhaps more effective than any military campaign, as kingdoms throughout the ancient world learned to fear Persian displeasure more than Persian armies. The first monarch whose methods we need to examine is Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great and ruler of Persia from 529 to 522 BCE. While his father Cyrus was remembered for his relatively merciful treatment of conquered peoples, Cambyses took the Persian approach to punishment in a dramatically different direction. Historical sources describe him as increasingly paranoid and cruel, but the evidence suggests his methods were carefully calculated rather than products of madness. Cambyses understood that his vast empire required more than administrative efficiency to maintain control. The sheer size of Persian territories meant that rebellion could spark in distant provinces before central authorities even learned of the unrest. Traditional military responses took months to organize and deploy, giving rebels time to consolidate their positions and recruit additional supporters. Cambyses needed a deterrent that would prevent rebellions from starting in the first place. The solution he developed was to make the consequences of rebellion so horrific that potential rebels would abandon their plans rather than risk capture. This required punishments that were not only physically devastating, but psychologically traumatic for observers. The goal wasn't just to eliminate individual threats, but to create collective trauma that would make entire populations compliant. Cambyses' approach to punishment involved several key innovations that would influence Persian practices for generations. First, he understood the importance of witnesses. Private executions, no matter how brutal, had limited deterrent effect. But public spectacles that forced entire communities to watch prolonged suffering created lasting psychological impacts. Citizens who witnessed these punishments would carry the memories for life, and their obvious trauma would serve as a constant reminder to others of the consequences of defying Persian authority. Second, Cambyses recognized that the family connections of rebels could be exploited to maximize psychological impact. Killing a rebel quickly was efficient but limited in its effect. However, forcing rebels to watch their family members suffer first created emotional torment that exceeded any physical pain. This approach also sent a clear message that Persian justice extended beyond individual criminals to encompass anyone associated with them. The third innovation involved the duration of punishment. Quick deaths, even violent ones, were soon forgotten by most observers. But punishments that lasted days or weeks created ongoing spectacles that dominated public consciousness. Citizens couldn't avoid thinking about the suffering taking place in their midst, and the constant presence of dying victims served as perpetual reminders of Persian power. These principles guided Cambyses in developing specific techniques that would become hallmarks of Persian cruelty. The methods he pioneered were refined by later rulers, but the fundamental approach remained consistent throughout Persian history. Each punishment was designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously, eliminating threats while terrorizing potential opponents and demonstrating the absolute nature of royal authority. The historical record suggests that Cambyses personally supervised many executions, not from sadistic pleasure, but to ensure that the punishments achieved their intended psychological effects. He studied the reactions of observers, noting which techniques produced the greatest fear and which methods were most effective at breaking the will of potential rebels. This systematic approach to cruelty reflected the same analytical mindset that made Persian administration so efficient. Contemporary accounts describe the atmosphere of terror that surrounded Cambyses' court, where nobles lived in constant fear of arousing royal displeasure. The king's unpredictable nature meant that even loyal servants could find themselves subjected to horrific punishments for minor infractions or imagined slights. This climate of fear ensured absolute obedience, while also providing a steady supply of victims to maintain the spectacle of royal justice. The methods employed by Cambyses were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror that began with a punishment so infamous it would echo through Persian history for centuries. The technique known as scaphism, or the boats, represented the pinnacle of Persian ingenuity in prolonging human suffering while maintaining the victim's consciousness throughout the ordeal. The process began with the selection of 2 boats or hollowed wooden troughs, precisely crafted to fit together like a coffin, while leaving the victim's head, hands, and feet exposed. The condemned person would be stripped naked and placed in the lower boat, their body coated with milk and honey to attract insects. The upper boat would then be fitted over them, creating a perfect seal except for the protruding extremities. What followed was a methodical destruction of the human body that could last for weeks. The milk and honey, forced down the victim's throat and smeared across their exposed skin, served multiple purposes in this calculated nightmare. Inside the sealed boats, the mixture would cause violent diarrhea and vomiting, creating a festering environment where the victim was forced to lie in their own waste. The sweet coating on their exposed flesh attracted swarms of flies, wasps, and other insects that would feed on the helpless prisoner. Contemporary Persian records, written in the flowery language of court scribes, describe how victims of scaphism would be fed regularly to prolong their ordeal. Guards would force-feed them milk and honey daily, ensuring they remained alive while their bodies slowly decomposed around them. The exposed portions of their anatomy would be consumed by insects and small animals. Yet medical attention was provided to prevent death from blood loss or infection, extending the agony for as long as physically possible. The psychological impact of scaphism extended far beyond the immediate victim. The boats were positioned in public spaces where citizens would be forced to encounter them during their daily routines. The sounds emanating from within the sealed boats, the increasingly putrid smell, and the sight of insects swarming over the exposed flesh created a living nightmare that dominated community consciousness. Children would have recurring nightmares about the boats, while adults found themselves unable to eat honey or drink milk without remembering the screams. Darius I, who ascended to the Persian throne in 522 BCE, inherited Cambyses' legacy of cruelty but refined it with his own innovations. Known to history as Darius the Great for his administrative and architectural achievements, he was equally great in his capacity for systematic brutality. The Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff face in western Iran, proudly documents his military victories while using euphemistic language to describe punishments that defied human comprehension. Darius understood that effective terror required variety. If subjects became accustomed to specific punishments, their psychological impact would diminish over time. He therefore developed what Persian court records called the Garden of Justice, a collection of different tortures that could be applied based on the nature of the crime and the social status of the criminal. This systematic approach to cruelty reflected the same organizational skills that made Darius one of history's greatest administrators. The technique known as the Persian bed became Darius's signature punishment for nobles who betrayed their trust. The condemned would be chained spread-eagle to a specially constructed platform that allowed access to every part of their body. Persian torturers would then begin a process of systematic mutilation that could last for months, removing small pieces of flesh each day while carefully avoiding vital organs and major blood vessels. The artistry of this punishment lay in its precision. Persian physicians worked alongside the torturers to ensure that victims remained conscious and healthy enough to experience each new day of suffering. Wounds were cleaned and treated to prevent infection. Amputated fingers and toes were cauterized to stop bleeding, and nutritious food was force-fed to maintain the victim's strength. The goal was to reduce a human being to the absolute minimum necessary for consciousness, while keeping them alive to experience their gradual destruction. Witnesses to these prolonged executions reported that victims would eventually begin begging for death with an intensity that disturbed even hardened Persian soldiers. The condemned would offer their torturers anything, confess to any crime, implicate any person, if only the suffering would end. But Darius had specifically ordered that no victim of the Persian bed should be granted the mercy of a quick death. The punishment was designed to last until the body's natural limits were reached, regardless of the victim's pleas or mental state. The public nature of these executions served multiple purposes in Darius's system of governance. Citizens were required to witness the punishments as part of their civic duties, creating a shared trauma that bound communities together in their fear of royal displeasure. The prolonged nature of the suffering meant that entire populations would spend months living with the sounds and smells of the dying, creating an atmosphere of perpetual dread that made rebellion unthinkable. Persian artists were commissioned to create detailed murals and sculptures depicting these punishments, ensuring that even those who couldn't attend the executions would understand the fate awaiting traitors. These artistic representations, found in palaces and administrative buildings throughout the empire, served as constant reminders of Persian justice, while also demonstrating the sophisticated nature of the empire's approach to terror. The religious justification for these extreme punishments came from Zoroastrian theology, which portrayed the world as a battleground between forces of light and darkness. Enemies of the Persian state were cast as servants of Ahriman, the destructive spirit, who deserved to experience the torments that awaited the wicked in the afterlife. This theological framework allowed Persian rulers to present their cruelty as divine mandate, making resistance not just politically dangerous, but spiritually damning. Darius expanded this religious justification by requiring victims to participate in their own condemnation. Before punishment began, the condemned would be forced to publicly renounce their actions and acknowledge the righteousness of their fate. Persian priests would conduct elaborate ceremonies where victims were required to confess their sins against the empire and beg forgiveness from the god-king they had offended. These forced confessions served to legitimize the punishments, while also creating additional psychological torment for the victims. The systematic nature of Persian punishment extended to the training of executioners, who underwent years of education to master their craft. Persian torture specialists studied anatomy, medicine, and psychology to maximize their effectiveness. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a victim was approaching death, allowing them to adjust their techniques to prolong the suffering. The most skilled practitioners could keep victims alive and conscious for extraordinary periods, creating reputations that enhanced the deterrent effect of their work. The hierarchy of Persian executioners reflected the empire's sophisticated approach to state-sponsored terror. Master torturers occupied positions of considerable prestige within the royal court, their expertise valued as highly as that of architects or military strategists. These specialists maintained detailed records of their techniques, documenting which methods produced the most effective psychological impact and how different punishments affected various social classes differently. Apprentice torturers would spend decades learning their craft under the guidance of established masters, studying not just the physical techniques, but the theatrical aspects that made Persian punishments so psychologically devastating. They learned to time their actions for maximum dramatic effect, to read crowd reactions and adjust their methods accordingly, and to coordinate with musicians and priests to create elaborate spectacles that transcended mere execution to become religious ceremonies celebrating royal power. The most accomplished practitioners developed signature techniques that became associated with their names. Court records mention the artistry of Mithridates, referring to a master torturer whose innovations in prolonging consciousness during extreme physical trauma were celebrated throughout the empire. These specialists competed with each other to develop increasingly sophisticated methods, driving a grotesque arms race in the science of human suffering. Persian monarchs would often summon multiple master torturers to collaborate on particularly significant punishments, combining their expertise to create experiences that surpassed anything previously imagined. These collaborative efforts resulted in executions that lasted for months, with victims passing between different specialists who would apply their unique techniques in carefully orchestrated sequences designed to maximize both physical agony and psychological terror. The equipment used in Persian punishments represented remarkable feats of engineering and craftsmanship. Specialized workshops throughout the empire produced instruments of torture with the same attention to detail that went into creating royal jewelry or ceremonial weapons. Bronze and iron were worked into devices so precisely calibrated that they could cause specific types of pain while avoiding accidental death. Archaeological discoveries have revealed the sophistication of these implements. Excavations at Persepolis uncovered chambers containing devices with adjustable components that could be modified based on the victim's size and the intended duration of punishment. Some instruments incorporated mechanical principles that would automatically increase pressure or adjust positioning as the victim's body changed during prolonged torture, ensuring consistent suffering without requiring constant supervision. The Persian approach to punishment also involved elaborate psychological preparation designed to maximize the victim's terror before physical suffering began. Condemned prisoners would be held in specially constructed cells, where they could hear the sounds of ongoing executions while being forced to contemplate their own fate. Guards would describe in graphic detail the punishments awaiting them, often using props and demonstrations to ensure the prisoners fully understood what they would experience. This psychological torture often proved as effective as physical punishment in achieving Persian objectives. Many prisoners would break completely during the preparatory phase, providing intelligence about rebel networks or confessing to crimes that exceeded their actual involvement. The anticipation of extreme physical pain created a form of mental anguish that Persian authorities learned to exploit systematically. Xerxes I, who ruled from 486 to 465 BCE, inherited his father Darius's systematic approach to cruelty, but added his own innovations that reflected his grandiose personality and unlimited resources. Known for assembling the largest army in ancient history for his invasion of Greece, Xerxes applied the same massive scale to his punishments, creating spectacles that dwarfed anything previous Persian rulers had attempted. The punishment that became most associated with Xerxes's reign was the living crucifixion, a technique that combined elements of traditional crucifixion with Persian innovations designed to prevent death while maximizing suffering. Unlike Roman crucifixion, which was designed to kill efficiently, the Persian version was engineered to sustain life for extraordinary periods while creating unimaginable agony. Victims would be secured to specially designed crosses that incorporated platforms and supports to prevent the rapid death that typically resulted from crucifixion. Persian physicians would monitor the condemned continuously, providing medical intervention when necessary to prevent death from blood loss, dehydration, or respiratory failure. The goal was to keep victims alive and conscious for weeks or even months while they hung in public view. The crosses themselves were works of perverted artistry, decorated with gold and precious stones that created a grotesque contrast with the suffering they supported. Positioned along major roads leading to Persian cities, these elaborate execution devices served as both punishment and propaganda, demonstrating royal power to every traveler who passed beneath them. Xerxes particularly favored this punishment for military leaders who opposed Persian expansion. The symbolic value of displaying enemy commanders in prolonged agony sent powerful messages to other potential opponents, while also satisfying Xerxes's need for dramatic gestures that matched his self-image as a god-king whose power transcended mortal limitations. The logistics required to maintain these prolonged crucifixions reflected the administrative capabilities that made the Persian Empire so effective in other areas. Teams of physicians, guards, and maintenance personnel were assigned to each site, ensuring that the spectacle continued uninterrupted for its intended duration. Food and medical supplies were transported along established supply lines, while replacement personnel were rotated in to prevent the staff from becoming desensitized to their duties. Persian record-keeping documented these executions with the same precision applied to tax collection or military campaigns. Court scribes maintained detailed logs of each victim's condition, noting physical deterioration, periods of consciousness, and responses to various interventions. This data was analyzed to improve future punishments, treating human suffering as a technical challenge requiring continuous refinement. The religious ceremonies surrounding these executions became increasingly elaborate under Xerxes's reign. Zoroastrian priests would conduct daily rituals at each crucifixion site, portraying the suffering as cosmic battles between good and evil. The condemned were cast as demons being purified through pain, while Xerxes was presented as an agent of divine justice, bringing order to a chaotic world. These religious interpretations served to normalize the extreme cruelty while also providing ideological justification for Persian expansion. Enemy resistance wasn't merely political opposition, but spiritual corruption that threatened cosmic harmony. This theological framework made Persian punishments seem not just acceptable, but morally necessary, allowing citizens to witness horrific suffering while maintaining their sense of righteousness. The psychological impact on Persian society itself became a significant factor in the empire's eventual decline. Generations of citizens who had been forced to witness these extreme punishments developed collective trauma that manifested in various social pathologies. Persian art and literature from later periods showed increasing preoccupation with death and suffering, while religious practices became more focused on appeasing divine wrath than celebrating divine benevolence. Contemporary foreign observers noted the atmosphere of paranoia and fear that pervaded Persian society during Xerxes' reign. Diplomats reported that even high-ranking Persian nobles seemed constantly terrified of arousing royal displeasure, while merchants and common citizens avoided any behavior that might be interpreted as disloyal. This climate of fear initially strengthened royal control, but ultimately weakened the empire by stifling innovation, honest communication, and voluntary cooperation. The techniques pioneered under Xerxes influenced punishment methods throughout the ancient world, as neighboring kingdoms adopted modified versions of Persian practices. However, few other civilizations possessed the administrative sophistication necessary to implement these methods on the massive scale that characterized Persian justice. The combination of technological innovation, medical knowledge, and organizational capability that made Persian punishments so effective was unique to the empire that created them. Archaeological evidence from Xerxes' reign includes mass burial sites containing remains that show evidence of prolonged torture before death. The condition of these skeletal remains provides physical confirmation of the extreme nature of Persian punishments, while also revealing details that contemporary accounts omitted or described euphemistically. Modern forensic analysis has identified evidence of medical intervention designed to prolong life during torture, supporting historical claims about the sophisticated nature of Persian execution methods. The financial cost of maintaining these elaborate punishment systems represented a significant drain on imperial resources, though Persian rulers considered it a necessary investment in social control. Court records document enormous expenditures for specialized equipment, trained personnel, medical supplies, and maintenance of execution sites. These costs were justified as preventing larger expenses associated with rebellions and military campaigns, though critics within the Persian administration questioned whether such extreme measures were truly cost-effective. The legacy of Persian punishment methods extended far beyond the empire's political boundaries, influencing concepts of justice and state power throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The systematic nature of Persian cruelty, combined with its religious justification and administrative sophistication, created a model of state-sponsored terror that would be studied and adapted by later civilizations facing similar challenges of controlling vast, diverse populations. The reign of Artaxerxes I, spanning from 465 to 424 BCE, marked the evolution of Persian cruelty into something approaching scientific methodology. Where his predecessors had relied on spectacle and duration to achieve their goals, Artaxerxes developed what Persian court records euphemistically called precision justice. This approach focused not on the scale of suffering, but on its surgical accuracy in targeting specific aspects of human psychology and physiology. Artaxerxes understood that different types of people required different approaches to break their will completely. A warrior who might endure physical pain without yielding could be destroyed by watching his children suffer. A merchant who feared financial ruin above death itself could be manipulated through threats to his business empire. A priest devoted to his god could be shattered by being forced to commit acts that violated his deepest beliefs. This individualized approach to torture required an intelligence network that penetrated every level of Persian society. Artaxerxes established what amounted to the world's first systematic psychological profiling system, with agents throughout the empire gathering detailed information about potential threats. These files contained not just political activities, but intimate details about family relationships, religious beliefs, personal fears, and individual weaknesses. When someone was marked for punishment, Persian authorities would spend weeks or even months preparing a customized ordeal designed specifically for that person. The technique known as the mirror of the soul exemplified this approach. Rather than applying generic tortures, executioners would craft experiences that targeted the victim's specific psychological vulnerabilities while forcing them to confront their deepest fears. For a Persian noble who prided himself on his bravery, the punishment might involve being stripped of all dignity and forced to perform humiliating acts while his family watched. The physical pain was minimal, but the psychological destruction was absolute. Witnesses reported seeing hardened warriors reduced to babbling madness within hours of beginning such personalized torments. Religious leaders faced punishments designed to destroy their faith along with their bodies. They would be forced to participate in ceremonies that violated their beliefs, to speak blasphemies against their gods, or to watch sacred objects being defiled in ways calculated to maximize their spiritual anguish. The goal wasn't just to kill them, but to ensure they died believing they had damned themselves eternally. The precision of these psychological attacks required Persian executioners to become skilled manipulators, capable of reading subtle emotional cues and adjusting their methods in real time. Master torturers during Artaxerxes' reign were as much psychologists as they were technicians, able to identify the exact moment when a victim's resistance began to crumble and exploit that weakness with devastating effectiveness. Persian medical knowledge advanced significantly during this period, driven partly by the need to understand human psychology and physiology well enough to manipulate both effectively. Court physicians developed detailed theories about the relationship between physical pain and mental anguish, documenting how different types of suffering affected various personality types. These medical advances had practical applications beyond torture. Persian armies began using psychological warfare tactics based on their understanding of how fear affected enemy soldiers. Diplomatic negotiations incorporated techniques for reading opponents' emotional states and exploiting their psychological vulnerabilities. The same knowledge that made Persian punishments so effective also enhanced the empire's military and political capabilities. The documentation from Artaxerxes' reign reveals a bureaucracy of cruelty that operated with the same efficiency as other imperial institutions. Different departments specialized in gathering intelligence, designing punishments, implementing executions, and analyzing results. Regular reports were submitted to higher authorities, evaluating the effectiveness of various techniques and recommending improvements for future applications. This systematic approach extended to the training of personnel involved in the punishment system. Persian torture specialists underwent formal education that included anatomy, psychology, theater, and religious studies. They learned to view their work as a form of statecraft, requiring intellectual sophistication rather than mere brutality. The most accomplished practitioners were celebrated as artists, whose skills contributed to imperial stability. The reign of Darius II, from 423 to 405 BCE, saw the introduction of what Persian records called generational justice, punishments designed to affect not just the immediate victim, but their descendants for years to come. This approach recognized that destroying an individual, no matter how thoroughly, had limited long-term impact unless the destruction extended to their entire bloodline and social network. The technique known as the inheritance of pain involved punishing entire family groups in ways that would create lasting trauma across multiple generations. Children would be forced to watch their parents suffer, ensuring they would carry psychological scars throughout their lives. These traumatized children would then raise their own children in an atmosphere of fear and submission, perpetuating Persian control across generations. Persian authorities developed sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting family networks, mapping relationships that extended far beyond immediate blood relatives. Punishment campaigns would systematically work through these networks, ensuring that anyone connected to the original offense would experience consequences proportionate to their relationship with the primary target. The psychological impact of generational punishment extended throughout Persian society, creating a culture where loyalty to the state took precedence over family bonds. Parents would report their own children for suspicious behavior, rather than risk having their entire bloodline marked for destruction. This self-policing mechanism reduced the resources required for surveillance while increasing the effectiveness of social control. Persian records from this period document the development of punishment techniques specifically designed to maximize hereditary trauma. Victims would be tortured in ways that created distinctive physical marks that would identify their descendants for generations. These marks served as permanent reminders of their family's disgrace, while also warning others about the long-term consequences of opposing Persian authority. The sophistication of these generational punishments required unprecedented coordination between different imperial departments. Census records were cross-referenced with intelligence reports to identify all members of targeted family networks. Administrative systems tracked punishment campaigns across multiple provinces and decades, ensuring that no branch of a condemned bloodline escaped attention. Religious justification for generational punishment drew on Zoroastrian concepts of inherited corruption, portraying the children and grandchildren of traitors as carriers of spiritual contamination that threatened cosmic order. This theological framework made systematic persecution of entire bloodlines seem not just acceptable, but religiously necessary. The legacy of Persian cruelty extends far beyond the dusty ruins of Persepolis and the crumbling remnants of ancient palaces. These techniques, refined over centuries of imperial rule, established a template for state-sponsored terror that would echo through history's darkest chapters. From the systematic brutality of Roman amphitheaters to the calculated horrors of medieval dungeons, the shadow of Persian methodology can be traced through countless civilizations that discovered the terrible effectiveness of transforming human suffering into political power. What makes these ancient punishments so disturbing isn't just their physical brutality, but their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Persian rulers recognized that true control required more than military conquest or administrative efficiency. They understood that fear, when properly cultivated and systematically applied, could achieve what armies alone could never accomplish. The empire that gave us magnificent architecture and complex administrative systems also perfected the science of breaking human will with surgical precision. The archaeological evidence continues to emerge from Persian sites, revealing new details about punishment chambers and execution grounds that confirm the most horrific accounts preserved in ancient texts. Modern forensic analysis of skeletal remains provides chilling testimony to the reality of Persian justice, while recently discovered court records add layers of detail that make these ancient horrors seem almost contemporary in their calculated efficiency. Perhaps most troubling is the recognition that the organizational capabilities and psychological insights that made Persian punishments so effective are not unique to ancient civilizations. The same technologies and methodologies that we celebrate in modern society, advances in medicine, psychology, and administrative coordination, could easily be turned towards similar purposes by those who view human suffering as an acceptable tool of governance. The Persian Empire ultimately collapsed, but not because their methods of control were ineffective. Rather, the very success of their terror campaigns created the conditions for their downfall. Generations of subjects traumatized by systematic cruelty developed a collective pathology that weakened the social bonds necessary for imperial stability. The fear that initially strengthened Persian rule eventually became a cancer that consumed the empire from within. As we close this examination of humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty, we're left with uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and the price of social control. The Persian monarchs achieved their immediate objectives through methods that shocked even their contemporary enemies. But their legacy serves as a warning about the ultimate futility of governing through fear alone. Their empire may have crumbled into dust, but the lessons embedded in their ruins remain as relevant today as they were 25 centuries ago. The winds that once carried screams across the Persian Empire now carry only silence, but the echoes of those ancient horrors continue to whisper warnings to anyone willing to listen. In our modern world, where technology has made both surveillance and violence more efficient than ever before, the Persian legacy reminds us that the capacity for systematic cruelty remains present in human civilization, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, justification, and power to emerge once again.